No one believed Lee Van Cleef could be a star until a desperate Italian director saw his face. What if I told you that the most terrifying face in Western movie history belonged to a man who painted seascapes for a living and refused to yell at his own children? What if I told you that the actor whose squint made audiences grip their armrests in fear was once so broke that a $70 payment for a painting felt like hitting the jackpot? And what if I told you that the man Hollywood threw away after 13 years of loyal service became one of the 10 biggest box office stars on the entire European continent? All because one Italian director looked at a face everyone else had rejected and saw a falcon? This is the story of Lee Van Cleef, a decorated World War II Navy veteran who earned a Bronze Star clearing mines in waters that could have killed him any second. A man who survived the most dangerous theaters of war, only to be destroyed by a car crash, a bottle, and an industry that decided his nose was the wrong shape. And if you grew up watching those piercing eyes stare down Clint Eastwood in the greatest Western ever filmed, then you already know how this story ends. But I promise you, you don't know how it begins. Here are 10 moments that prove Lee Van Cleef's life was more dramatic than any movie he ever made. Number 10. The War That Forged the Squint. On January 9th, 1925, a boy named Clarence Leroy Van Cleef Jr. was born in Somerville, New Jersey. His father was a pharmacist. His mother was a concert pianist. Both were of Dutch ancestry, with roots in Somerset County going back generations. And by the time young Lee turned 17, he had already made the first major decision of his life. He graduated from Somerville High School early in 1942, specifically so he could enlist in the United States Navy. Think about that. 17 years old. While other kids were worrying about dances and football games, Lee Van Cleef was training as a sonar operator, hunting German U-boats in the Caribbean aboard the USS C-681, a submarine chaser that could have been blown out of the water any given Tuesday. He then transferred to the USS Incredible, an Admirable-class minesweeper. And the name of that ship should tell you everything about what came next. Aboard the Incredible, Van Cleef participated in Operation Dragoon on the Allied invasion of southern France. His job, clearing enemy mines along the French coastline. One wrong reading on that sonar equipment, one missed signal, and every man on that ship was dead. In September 1944, his ship helped neutralize a German human torpedo attack on Allied vessels. In January 1945, the Incredible sailed to the Black Sea, performing mine-sweeping duties from the Soviet naval base at Sevastopol in Crimea, then back to Sicily, and then on to the Pacific Theater for Operation Skagway, clearing mines around the Ryukyu Islands and the East China Sea. Records confirm Lee Van Cleef achieved the rank of Sonarman First Class. He earned a Bronze Star for Distinguished Service, along with the Good Conduct Medal, the World War II Victory Medal, and campaign medals for the American, European, African, Middle Eastern, and Asiatic Pacific theaters. He was honorably discharged on February 20th, 1946. One more thing from his Navy days. Van Cleef started wearing a pierced earring in his left ear during his service. He later explained it was a symbol of respect for the different cultures and people he encountered sailing the world. Directors would later ask him to wear it on camera. The war gave Lee Van Cleef his toughness. It gave him his bearing. And that famous squint? Some say it came from years of staring across bright ocean waters, scanning for enemy threats. The ocean didn't just shape his face, it sculpted it. Number 9. The nose they wanted to cut off. After the war, Van Cleef drifted. He played in an amateur dance band, worked on farms, took a job as a time-study methods analyst at a plant. He was going nowhere. Then a friend dragged him to the little theater group in Clinton, New Jersey, to try out for a part. He won the role of George in Our Town, and something clicked. As Van Cleef later recalled, he went out one night by a friend's invitation, tried out for a part, and damn if he didn't make it. Talent scouts spotted him. They took him to New York to meet agent Maynard Morris at MCA. Morris sent him to audition at the Alvin Theater, where he won a role in the National Touring Company of Mr. Roberts. There was one catch. The job started Monday. Van Cleef protested. He needed to give his employer 2 weeks' notice. When he told his boss, the man fired him on the spot, saying if Van Cleef wanted to do this thing, then he was fired. That firing freed him to take the role. During a Mr. Roberts performance in Los Angeles, producer Stanley Kramer spotted Van Cleef and wanted him for the role of Deputy Harvey Pell in High Noon, a prominent, sympathetic speaking part opposite Gary Cooper. There was one condition. Kramer wanted Van Cleef to surgically alter his distinctive hooked nose. Van Cleef refused. He told Kramer exactly where he could go. So Kramer called back the next day and offered him the non-speaking role of Jack Colby, one of the silent gunslingers waiting at the train station. The deputy role went to Lloyd Bridges. That refusal defined Lee Van Cleef's entire career. His hawk-like nose, sharp, angular cheekbones, and steely slit eyes made him a natural heavy. His own famous assessment, being born with a pair of beady eyes, was the best thing that ever happened to him. Bad guys had always been his bag. Between 1952 and 1963, E. Van Cleef appeared in a staggering number of productions: Kansas City Confidential, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, The Big Combo, Gunfight at the OK Corral with Burt Lancaster, Ride Lonesome with Randolph Scott, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance as a henchman of Lee Marvin in John Ford's classic with John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. On television, he appeared in virtually every major Western series of the era: The Rifleman, Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Have Gun Will Travel, The Lone Ranger, You Wanted Dead or Alive. He was everywhere, and always the heavy, never the star. Number 8, the crash that nearly ended everything. By the late 1950s, Lee Van Cleef had something far worse than bad luck. He had a disease. In 1959, Van Cleef was involved in a severe, alcohol-related car crash that shattered his left kneecap, broke his leg, and broke his arm. Doctors told him he would never ride a horse again. For an actor whose entire livelihood depended on westerns, that was a death sentence. Van Cleef defied the prognosis. He was back in the saddle within 6 months, but the injury left him with a permanent limp. For the rest of his career, he could not run, could only ride docile horses, and often needed a stepladder to mount. Meanwhile, his first marriage to high school sweetheart Patsy Ruth Cale, the woman he'd married on December 10th, 1943, the woman who'd given him 3 children, Alan, Deborah, and David, that marriage was over. He married Joan Drain on April 9th, 1960. But the drinking didn't stop, and Hollywood was done with him. Sergio Leone himself later described what he discovered when he went looking for Van Cleef years later. Leone contacted a small-time agent who told him Van Cleef wasn't working anymore because he'd been in a clinic for alcoholics for 3 years, and all the studios had slammed their doors in his face. Number 7, the $70 painting and the missing fingertip. Between 1962 and 1965, Lee Van Cleef had effectively left the film industry. His last credited role was a small part in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance in 1962. His photo disappeared from current casting annuals. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody cared. Van Cleef and Joan survived on TV residual checks, unemployment payments, and Joan's salary as a secretary. They were scarcely able to pay a phone bill. So what did the man who'd stared down Gary Cooper, who'd traded gunfire on screens across America, do with his time? He painted seascapes, landscapes, portraits, a figure work, oils on canvas. When somebody paid him $70 for a painting, he considered it significant income. He and Joan started an interior decoration business out of their home in Granada Hills, California. The great Lee Van Cleef, the man whose face would one day be projected 50 feet high on screens across Europe, was painting seascapes for grocery money. During the same period, while building a playhouse for his daughter, he cut off the tip of his right middle finger. Not in a bar fight, not in the car accident, building a playhouse. That missing fingertip is visible in close-up handshots during his later gunfight scenes. A tiny, permanent reminder of the years when Hollywood forgot he existed. Number 6. The Falcon in the Dirty Raincoat. The resurrection of Lee Van Cleef is one of cinema's greatest second-act stories, and it started with a cascade of rejections by bigger names. For his film For a Few Dollars More in 1965, a director Sergio Leone's first choice was Lee Marvin. Marvin had an oral agreement, but pulled out days before shooting to make Cat Ballou, a decision that won Marvin the Oscar. Henry Fonda was too expensive. Charles Bronson turned it down. Robert Ryan was also considered. With all top choices exhausted, Leone remembered an actor from small roles in High Noon and The Bravado. He found Van Cleef's face in an old casting catalog. His photo no longer appeared in current editions. Leone was a Western film obsessive who had cataloged actors from hundreds of American Westerns, but tracking Van Cleef down proved nearly impossible. Nobody knew what had become of him. The meeting, as Leone recalled it, was cinematic in itself. Van Cleef arrived on a day of torrential rain. He had traveled a great distance. He wore an old dirty raincoat. He tapped lightly on its buttons. From his raised collar emerged that head, with its short-cropped, salt and pepper hair. Was that face resembling a falcon's? Leone said he was even better than the character he'd dreamed of. The years of hardship, aging, and defeat had actually made Van Cleef more suited to the role than the younger version Leone remembered. Van Cleef didn't even understand he was being offered a co-starring role. He assumed it was for a few scenes. He nearly turned it down because he didn't want to jeopardize his painting career. He genuinely worried that accepting would force him to return the $70 someone had just paid him for a painting. When Leone had a check written for approximately $1,000 as an advance, Van Cleef almost fainted. He signed the contract on April 10, 1965, for a total salary of $17,000, described as 30% more than he had ever previously made. 2 days later, he was in Italy filming. The detail that captures everything: after paying his agents 10%, Van Cleef drove home and tossed an envelope of cash near Joan without a word. The rubber band broke, and bills scattered across the room. Joan, who knew nothing of the offer, alternated between laughing and crying, taking 4 attempts to count the money. Number 5. The bounty hunter who drew in 1/8 of a second. Leone's genius was in seeing what Hollywood had missed for 13 years. He cast Van Cleef as Colonel Douglas Mortimer, a hero, not a villain. Mortimer was a sophisticated former Confederate Army officer turned bounty hunter, motivated by personal vengeance for his sister's death, carrying a musical pocket watch as a memento. The character was a walking arsenal, a buntline special, a Colt Lightning shotgun, a Winchester rifle, and a double-barreled Le Faucheux. And here's what made it brilliant. Van Cleef's permanent limp from the car accident actually enriched the character. Leone designed Mortimer to move with deliberate, a stately authority rather than athletic speed. He turned a disability into gravitas. Van Cleef claimed to be faster on the draw than Clint Eastwood, taking only 3 frames of film, 1/8 of a second, to draw, cock, and fire. The film shot from mid-April to end of June 1965 in Tabernas, Almeria, Spain, and Cinecittà Studios in Rome on a $600,000 budget. It grossed $25.5 million worldwide. The man who'd been painting seascapes for $70 had just co-starred in one of the most profitable westerns ever made. Number 4, Angel Eyes and the spoon that was more terrifying than a gun. For the good, the bad, and the ugly. In 1966, Leone originally wanted Charles Bronson for Van Cleef's role, but Bronson was committed to the Dirty Dozen. So Leone made a brilliant creative decision. He'd had Van Cleef play a romantic character in For a Few Dollars More, but now the idea of getting him to play the complete opposite began to appeal to him. Angel Eyes, called sentenza, meaning sentence or judgment in the Italian version, is pure, distilled sociopathy, a ruthless mercenary who always finishes a job for which he is paid. Van Cleef's performance is a masterclass in stillness and understatement. In the character's introductory scene, Angel Eyes eats a meal in a victim's home before killing him. Critics noted that the way he uses his spoon is more terrifying than the gun. Think about that. A spoon. In the hands of Lee Van Cleef, a common piece of cutlery became one of cinema's most chilling moments. Production began at Cinecittà Studios in Rome in mid-May 1966 on a budget of $1.2 million. The iconic Sad Hill Cemetery for the climactic three-way standoff was purpose-built near Santo Domingo de Silos in Spain. Several hundred Spanish soldiers constructed thousands of gravestones and wooden crosses. That standoff scene lasts approximately 5 minutes, with almost no dialogue. Editor Eugenio Alabiso and Leone used increasingly tight close-ups. First the waist, then the chest, then just the eyes. Ennio Morricone composed music that Leone described as making the corpses laugh from inside their tombs. Van Cleef's eyes dart between Eastwood and Wallace, knowing he's the odd man out. The film grossed over $38 million worldwide against its $1.2 million budget. It is now recognized as one of the greatest westerns and one of the greatest films ever made. Number 3, the biggest star in Europe that America barely noticed. Here's the paradox of Lee Van Cleef's career. By the early 1970s, he was one of the 10 most popular box office stars on the entire European continent. Yet, in America, he was still primarily known as a 1950s TV villain. He chose to stay in Europe, where he could command leading roles and substantial paychecks. His most acclaimed non-Leone spaghetti western was The Big Gun Down in 1967, directed by Sergio Leone, with another stunning Ennio Morricone score. Death Rides a Horse paired him with John Philip Law. Day of Anger cast him as a mentor, gunslinger opposite Giuliano Gemma. The Sabata trilogy showcased a lighter, more tongue-in-cheek Van Cleef. In the first Sabata in 1969, he played a crackshot bounty hunter with a 4-barreled Derringer and a colleague who hid a gun inside a banjo. For Adios Sabata in 1970, producers refused to meet Van Cleef's salary demands, so they replaced him with Yul Brynner. That is how far his asking price had risen. His earnings trajectory tells the whole story, from approximately $5,000 per film in his Hollywood supporting actor days, to $17,000 for a few dollars more, to $400,000 to $500,000 per picture by the late 1960s. Italian distributors were so eager to capitalize on his fame that they retroactively re-promoted his minor Hollywood roles. Italian poster art elevated his small part in High Noon to make him appear as Gary Cooper's co-star. In total, Van Cleef appeared in approximately 20 to 25 European westerns and over 50 westerns overall across his career. The man Hollywood couldn't give away was now too expensive for some of Europe's biggest studios. But number 2, Snake Plissken's boss and a ninja named McAllister. Van Cleef's most significant American comeback role was Police Commissioner Bob Hawke in John Carpenter's Escape from New York in 1981. Carpenter deliberately cast Van Cleef to leverage his established screen authority, placing him alongside Ernest Borgnine, Donald Pleasence, and Harry Dean Stanton. Hawke is the stern government figure who blackmails Snake Plissken into rescuing the president from Manhattan's maximum security prison island. The scenes between Van Cleef and Kurt Russell, mutual respect masked by antagonism, gave the film much of its tension. Kurt Russell himself has said that Van Cleef's presence inspired him to model Snake's voice after Clint Eastwood. In 1984, Van Cleef starred in what became an unlikely cult curiosity, The Master, an NBC television series where he played John Peter McAllister, described as the first American to achieve full ninja mastery, a World War II and Korean War veteran turned ninja, traveling in a custom van with a young sidekick, searching for his long-lost daughter. Sho Kosugi co-starred as his nemesis. A young Demi Moore appeared in the pilot episode. The series lasted 13 episodes before cancellation, but it achieved an unexpected afterlife when episodes were re-edited into compilation movies and mockingly celebrated on Mystery Science Theater 3000 in 1992. In 1983, Van Cleef received the Golden Boot Award for his contributions to the Western genre. He had a pacemaker installed in the early 1980s. The years of hard living were catching up. Number 1. The gravestone that reads, "Best of the Bad." Lee Van Cleef collapsed at his home in Oxnard, California, at approximately 11:40 p.m. on Friday, in December 15, 1989. He was pronounced dead at St. John's Regional Medical Center shortly after midnight on December 16, 1989. He was 64 years old. The primary cause was a heart attack. Throat cancer, unknown to the public, was listed as a secondary cause. He is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in the Hollywood Hills of Los Angeles. His gravestone reads, Lee Van Cleef. January 9th, 1925 to December 16th, 1989. Best of the Bad, Love and Light. His career total, 90 film roles and 109 television appearances over 38 years. More than 170 combined credits. But here's the thing about Lee Van Cleef that outlasts any filmography. It's the contrast. The most menacing face in screen history belonged to a man his own son described as probably one of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet. A man who drew firm moral lines even for his villains. He would never kick dogs, never hurt a child, never slap a woman on film. 3 things he wouldn't do, period. His cultural afterlife has been extraordinary. Hideo Kojima modeled Revolver Ocelot in the Metal Gear Solid video game series directly after Van Cleef, Cad Bane from Star Wars. The Clone Wars was based on his Angel Eyes performance. Philip Pullman named his character Lee Scoresby in his Dark Materials as a direct tribute. The band Primus recorded a track called Lee Van Cleef. He and the Fugees paid him perhaps the ultimate compliment when they declared themselves more magnificent than Lee Van Cleef. Think about that. A kid from Somerville, New Jersey, who cleared mines in World War II, who Hollywood threw away because his nose was wrong, who painted seascapes for $70, who almost fainted at a $1,000 check. That man's face became so iconic that video game designers, cartoon creators, novelists, and musicians are still referencing it almost 4 decades after his death. Hollywood wanted to fix his nose. Leone wanted that nose. Hollywood saw a disposable villain. Leone saw a Falcon. The very features, age, and damage that made Van Cleef unemployable in 1964 made him magnetic in 1965. And if that isn't the most documented, verified, absolutely real example of how one person seeing your potential can change everything, then I don't know what is. Rest easy, Lee. You were the best of the bad.